In terms of then the general roles and responsibilities of a sporting director, so I've only had I've had Mark Cartwright, who's sporting director at Huddersfield Town. I've had him on. He told me about his role, so I'll link that below for anyone that wants to check that out. But it seems to me like the sporting director role is heavily skewed towards recruitment, but then I also want to touch on what you said there in terms of maybe it's not how it should be the role. So what did you mean by that, Jeremy? And can you expand?
Yeah, good question. So the sporting director role, um, people think, and this is the first part of it. People think that in Europe there's a much more defined role for sporting directors because that name of the role has been around a long time. That's not really my experience of it. My experience of outside, let's say outside of the big five leagues, let's put them to one side. Outside of those leagues, the role of sporting director is essentially head of recruitment. It's just termed sporting director, so it is completely skewed toward recruitment.
Mm.
There, because of the infrastructure of those clubs, there aren't massive departments like there are in the Premier League. So let's take a Premier League club, for example. You're going to have an academy which is going to have minimum 50, 60 members of staff.
Mm.
You're going to have a sports science department with at least 10, 15 at first team level, 10, 15 at academy level. You're going to have medical departments. You're going to have analysis departments. You're going to have player welfare departments, player care departments. So, education departments. There's a whole structure that a sporting director needs to be able to oversee. And I'll come back to that in a second. In the rest of Europe, that isn't quite as advanced. So you're going to have very small scouting departments. You're going to have, an academy which is not structured in that way, mainly focused around the under 19 team or under 21 team, depending on the country. So there isn't that much to manage outside of the first team environment. So mostly the sporting directors are first team based, and mainly on the recruitment side and the scouting side, and they live and die by that. What's been interesting, I think, is looking at the countries like Germany and England where there are large departments, and there does need to be a different type of skill set to bring all of those things together, kind of under one banner. And I think a lot of the staff that have taken those roles who have been very, very successful have actually not been in the recruitment environment. So I'm not saying heads of recruitment that go on to be sporting directors can't be successful. They can, of course, but I think it's been really interesting that let's take, for example, what's a good example? Just trying to run through some. John Rudkin at Leicester. So an
Mm.
academy director
Yeah.
who, in his role as academy director, will have managed those strands. He'll have managed players, player development. He'll have managed the coaching staff basically. He'll have managed the medical team, the sports science team, the analysis team. He'll have done that, and then basically stepping up
Mm.
to the first team ends up doing the same thing. So now he's kind of learned that role as an academy director, and people like Stuart Webber come from a similar background. So those kind of that background as an academy director kind of sets you up nicely to be able to run those multiple departments. Um, Interestingly, the staff that are probably the next layer down, who are kind of more adept at doing that, will probably be staff from analytics and analysis because they'd have come from a kind of an education background, come from a background of kind of trying to learn the management side of things, and utilizing data to do that across various departments. So they'll have already worked kind of multidisciplinary, and also probably heads of performance, so sports scientists that have ended up leading the medical and the sports science department, kind of adding a couple of extra strands to that, like analysis or scouting, probably isn't that much of a leap. Whereas I think coming from a coaching background into that is a little bit more difficult, depending on how you managed your staff beforehand. But if you're a kind of pure coach or a pure scout, kind of managing across other departments is probably a little bit of a shock. But yeah, not necessarily. It all depends on the candidate, obviously. But yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like there may be more? Because I think was it Barnsley recently hired their sporting director. He's from I don't know if you know him, but he comes from a data background. So do you think that will be something that you might see more of clubs going down that route of hiring data personnel for those types of roles?
Yeah, I know Mladen Sum as well, and I think it's a really good choice by Barnsley to begin with. I think he's obviously experienced quite a lot of different environments. He was at Huddersfield and then Leicester and then 777
Mm.
with the multi-club kind of environment. Um, I do actually. I think tapping into those kind of analytics staff, I think that will be something that happens more often. I think it will be something that will grow. But I think you get you get a kind of pros and cons of everyone. Everyone comes from a different background, right?
Yeah.
There's not many people that have worked across multiple areas. I think probably I'm one of the very few that's done coaching, that's done analysis, that's done sports science stuff, that's done that's been across that. And obviously working for Double Pass, I got to see a lot of those departments in one that kind of strategic overview.
Mm.
Um, but there aren't that many kind of people that have worked across multiple departments. You kind of specialize either as a coach or a scout or an analyst. So I think there's always a kind of going to be a focus of that person upon certain areas. So someone that's been a head of scouting that becomes a sporting director is obviously going to lean on their own experience and skill set to to maximize the scouting department, and might well appoint someone as an assistant. I need some experience, as an assistant sporting director, someone who specializes in sports science and medicine, for example, because that's not my specialty. So I think you're always going to get that, but yeah, I think the more diverse you can be in terms of appointments, and I think that's what's going to end up happening. You're going to end up getting probably more diverse in terms of the departments that those people have worked in, but also, and I think this is a really interesting one, more diverse in terms of where those candidates come from outside of football. I think you're going to find a lot of sporting directors coming into those roles who are either from a business environment or from a different sport. So yes, for me, it's a really interesting role which hasn't quite been defined yet, and different clubs kind of see it in a different way. But I don't think necessarily we have to be too um, kind of constrained by, oh, in Europe they do this or whatever, because I haven't actually seen, okay, the German model is very good and some of the French clubs are doing some interesting things, but I think a lot of the clubs that people refer to, often I'm thinking actually that role at that club is a pure scouting role. It doesn't really, it wouldn't fit, that person wouldn't necessarily fit in the Premier League,
Mm.
because they're going to be asked to do so much more than they're used to doing.
Yeah.